the Center of Drug Evaluation and Research is one of the centers within the FDA structure, and it is in this center where the Office of New Drugs resides. And within the Office of New Drugs, we are divided into several scientific review divisions, which are based on disease-specific areas. And so the division in which the pulmonary fibrosis drugs are largely reviewed are the Division of Pulmonary, Allergy, and Rheumatology Products, which is where I work. And so within our division, we are a division of multiple disciplines, including medical doctors, not only pulmonologists, but critical care doctors, internal medicine doctors, pediatricians, but we also have pharmacologists and toxicologists that work with us to look at the animal data that's generated prior to going into humans, and we have a large host of support staff, including our regulatory project managers, which really help us to implement the regulations in order to review drug applications. So that's where the division fits into the whole organizational structure. Within the division, I'm a clinical team leader, which means I am one of the supervisory staff that is involved in the review activities of drugs all along their development pathway. So that's a little bit about the organization of the FDA, where our division falls in, and my role within the division. And I think you also asked a little bit about the history of, where what we do in the FDA comes from. And the history can be very long, but very interesting, so I'll try to summarize it briefly. The modern era of the FDA really dates back to 1906, when the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed. And this was an act that added regulatory function to the agency's scientific mission. It prohibited interstate transport of unlawful food and drugs under penalty of seizure. But important as it was fraught with shortcomings because it didn't regulate medical devices or cosmetics, and it didn't give the FDA any explicit authority to inspect factories, to prosecute false therapeutic claims, and it really didn't give us any control over what drugs could be marketed. And so really what came to happen shortly after in 1937 really was defining. And in 1937, there was a company that tried to introduce an elixir of sulfanilamide. And it was a flavorful oral dosage form, and it was a new anti-infective that was supposed to be a wonder drug, which was a disaster. The firm used an untested solvent, which was diethylene glycol, which is chemically related to antifreeze. And by the time FDA became aware of that problem and removed the product from the pharmacy shelves, the preparation had caused over 100 deaths, including many children. So that disaster actually reinvigorated a bill to replace the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, which had been languishing in Congress for the past 4 or 5 years. And so at that point in 1938, President Roosevelt actually signed the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act into law. And among many provisions, it required that firms had to prove to FDA that a new drug was safe before it could be marketed. And this was really the birth of what we call the NDA, or the New Drug Application. And this new law covered cosmetics and medical devices, and authorized factory inspections, and outlawed bogus therapeutic claims for drugs. And it was really there so that someone could review these claims prior to marketing. And so with that, we took one step closer to having drugs having to be safe before they were marketed. And then we went even one step closer to where we are now, which is a new drug law called in the Kefauver-Harris Amendments. And this was again, an act that came on the heels of a disaster that was narrowly averted. Thalidomide, in this case, was a sedative that was never approved in this country, but produced thousands of grossly deformed newborns outside the United States. And so this new mandated efficacy law, this new law mandated efficacy as well as safety before the drug could be marketed, and it required FDA to assess the efficacy of all drugs and instituted stricter control over drug trials. So this is where the work that we currently do as the FDA comes from in terms of determining the efficacy and safety of drugs prior to going to market.
Thank you. That was fantastic and very helpful, and kind of sets the frame for my next question, which is now with all of the regulation and fantastic work the FDA does, we want to understand how this happens. What are the FDA requirements for a drug to be approved? What is the burden of evidence that you want to see?
So again, the FDA requirements for drug approval are actually codified in the Code of Federal Regulations, and so everything we do is mandated by regulation and by law. And in general terms, approval of an application requires that the application meets the requirements for safety, efficacy, manufacturing, controls, and labeling. So different disciplines within the agency review each of these broad areas. So the clinical teams and the statistical teams are looking at efficacy and safety, but we have a large team of chemists and also labeling consultants within the agency that are making sure that all of these 4 components in terms of manufacturing controls, labeling, safety, and efficacy are all met. And I'll speak less about the manufacturing and controls today, because that's not really my area of expertise. And these types of things are usually handled by the chemists within the agency, but I'll speak more to the efficacy and safety because those are the things that are clinically reviewed. And so the efficacy standard that we abide by states that a program must provide substantial evidence consisting of adequate and well-controlled investigations that a drug product will have the effect that it purports or is represented to have under the conditions of use prescribed, recommended, or suggested in the proposed labeling. And this is our efficacy standard. I think depending on the disease area and depending on the number of patients that are available to study in certain disease areas, substantial evidence is definitely something that can be flexible. It usually means, and has usually been interpreted to mean, 2 adequate and well-controlled investigations, but there are cases within the agency where the results of 1 robust study can also be considered as substantial evidence. So this really does become an issue that is discussed with sponsors at the time during development. So that's the efficacy standard. And then the safety standard is, again, the Code of Federal Regulations is written in a way that is, what would cause one to refuse to approve an application based on safety. So this safety standard explains that an application wouldn't be approved if it didn't include all the tests, adequate tests by all methods reasonably applicable to show whether the drug is safe for use, if the results of the test show that the drug is unsafe for use, or if there's insufficient information to determine whether the product is safe. So the safety standard is sort of more general, and this is very closely reviewed by the review divisions in terms of the safety data that the sponsors provide to us. And then finally, I'll just say that we do have a we use this as part of our regulatory framework when we're making decisions about whether or not drugs have met the efficacy and safety standards as codified within the Code of Federal Regulations. And we take all of these things together and really try to make a benefit risk assessment. And one of the things that patients will see with the new reviews that are coming out with drugs that are being approved is a real push to summarize what the benefit risk assessment is. And all of our reviews are now opened with what's called a benefit risk assessment table, which really summarizes what the benefits of the drug are, what the risks to the patients are, and what the agency's assessment of that balance is, either supporting or not supporting approval of the drug.
Thanks for that. That was very, very helpful. So we have another question up here, which is very closely related, and I think you've addressed some of this. The question is, what are the steps taken by drug developers and by the FDA to lead to FDA approval? And maybe what I could ask you to summarize here are the different phases of clinical trials. I think a lot of listeners aren't certain what phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, and perhaps even phase 4 clinical trials are. Would you be able to educate our listeners on that?
Absolutely. So so the FDA is often involved even prior to the traditional clinical phases of development. So I will certainly summarize phase 1 through phase 4 trials, but we are often involved in consulting with companies regarding development of their products, even when they're just starting off their non-clinical testing, either in vitro or in animal studies. So this work will come before the phase 1 human studies and is really used to define doses that would be safe to administer to patients. And these consist of various tests to evaluate safety prior to proceeding in human subjects. So with that information in hand and knowing which doses will be safe, at least using the animal data to go into humans, the phase 1 portion of a clinical development program usually consists of first-in-human studies and really studies to define what the safety and tolerability of doses administered to humans would be. So in these studies, we typically look at multiple doses in both single doses and short multiple dose repeated doses to see what the safety and tolerability profile are, what the drug exposure in terms of blood levels is in human patients, because we have some of that information from the animals, and to see if that's comparable or not. And we're really trying to identify a safe and tolerable dose prior to proceeding into the next phase of development. Once phase 1 studies are completed, phase 2, and again, this is along a continuum, phase 2 begins. The phase 2 development program typically includes dose ranging. So we have an idea of the doses that are tolerated, but we don't know which doses will be the most effective in treating the disease at hand. So we ask sponsors conduct robust dose ranging studies so that way we can be sure that the dose with the best risk-benefit assessment is being carried forward. So that usually occurs in phase 2. And phase 2, as part of that, is really a proof of concept phase. So we know that we can safely give this drug to humans, but we want to show now that it actually is going to do what we think it's going to do. And so that's really what's established in phase 2. Phase 3 is typically defined as the pivotal studies in a clinical program. The phase 3 studies, these are the studies that patients will see in support of marketing of a drug that will appear in the product label, and these are again, rigorously designed and conducted studies that with pre-specified statistical analysis plans that will be analyzed by the agency to support the marketing of the product. And then finally, drugs may be approved with certain questions still remaining, especially regarding long-term safety outcomes, and that's where the phase 4 clinical development comes in, and these are studies that may be required or done post-marketing of a product to further elucidate any remaining safety questions that might have arisen during the phase 3 program.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful. I think I even learned a couple of things in there, so thank you. Now, one of the very common questions we get through our Patient Communication Center is about the different designations that are given during the drug development process. And I think some of these terms get folks really excited that a drug might be on the verge of being approved or that the drug is effective. And I'd love to have you clarify for us. There are 5 different terms, and maybe you can give us all insight and understanding about these. So the 2 up on the screen right now are orphan drug status and the term fast track. Can you address both of those for us?
Sure. So I think we have them split up onto 2 different slides here, but really I think probably fast track belongs on the next slide. And so I'll address orphan drug status, and then I'll sort of go through fast track, breakthrough therapy, accelerated approval, and priority review, because really there is a distinction. And so the orphan drug status, or orphan drug designation as we call it, is a program that provides what we call orphan status to drugs and biologics. And these are defined as those drugs which are intended for the safe and effective treatment, diagnosis, or prevention of rare diseases or disorders that affect fewer than 200,000 people in the United States, or that they affect more than 200,000 persons but are not expected to recover the costs of developing and marketing a treatment drug. So what this status really, when this status is conveyed to a drug, it's really defining not only the drug, but the disease that it's treating. It's a rare disease that it's treating. And the reason that, one of the orphan, there's an act from which this designation comes. It's called the Orphan Drug Act. And it provides for granting special status to drugs or biologic products upon request of a sponsor. And this is really done if the specific disease or condition criteria are met, and this qualifies the sponsor for various development incentives, including financial incentives, qualified clinical testing, and for those listeners who aren't aware, when sponsors submit, typically when sponsors submit a new drug application, a marketing application to review, for review to the agency, they pay a fee in order for their drug application to be reviewed. A drug that's granted orphan drug designation isn't subject to this user fee unless other criteria are met. But for sort of the simplest, if your drug has orphan drug designation, the fee is basically waived. And so this is really to incentivize sponsors to develop drugs for these rare diseases and orphan populations, which really there may not be a financial incentive on their part to develop drugs for these conditions. So that is really a status and can be granted basically at any time for a drug that is determined to treat a rare disease. And again, that's affecting fewer than 200,000 people in the United States. So we have an office that reviews those designation requests to see if the disease actually does meet that criteria. So the other 4 that are listed, and maybe we can, I don't know if you want to move on to the next slide, but I won't forget about fast track. So, fast track and breakthrough therapy, accelerated approval, and priority review. Again, these are what we call within the agency our expedited programs for serious conditions. And these programs are really intended to facilitate and expedite development and review of new drugs to address unmet medical need in the treatment of serious or life-threatening conditions, such as IPF, for example. And so these are the 4 programs: Fast Track Designation, Breakthrough Therapy Designation, Accelerated Approval, and Priority Review. And so these programs are really intended to help ensure that therapies for serious conditions are approved and available to patients as soon as it can be concluded that the therapy's benefits justify the risks. And so all 4 expedited programs represent efforts to address an unmet medical need in the treatment of a serious condition. And as with everything, all of these terms are explicitly defined. So again, we interpret the term serious to be a disease or condition associated with morbidity that has substantial impact on day-to-day functioning. And short-lived and self-limiting morbidity would usually not be sufficient, but the morbidity need not be irreversible if it's persistent or recurrent. So we have also determined what, and again, these are programs that sponsors apply for their drugs. Again, and I understand that when something receives, breakthrough therapy designation or fast track designation, it can be interpreted in a number of ways. So I want to provide what is actually required for each of these programs, what criteria is required, so that we can understand and maybe sort of weigh what each of these designations really means. So with that, I'll start with fast track. So the qualifying criteria for a program to meet fast track or to be granted fast track designation is that it's intended to treat a serious condition, and non-clinical or clinical data demonstrate the potential to address unmet medical need. So I'll contrast this with breakthrough therapy designation, which is one of our newer expedited programs. And breakthrough therapy requires that the drug is also intended to treat a serious condition, but there should be preliminary clinical evidence that indicates that the drug may demonstrate substantial improvement on clinically significant endpoints over available therapies. So you can see that the criteria for being designated a breakthrough therapy product are much more stringent than the criteria required for gaining fast track designation. So in general, we consider IPF to be a serious condition. And if a sponsor could come in with, even some non-clinical data that suggests that this drug attenuates lung fibrosis, it'd be very likely that they would be granted fast track designation. However, if they don't have preliminary clinical evidence that shows that their drug is substantially better over available therapies, they wouldn't be designated as a breakthrough therapy. So the breakthrough therapy requirements are higher. The criteria is more stringent, and we need more data to look at and review prior to granting breakthrough therapy designation. I'll skip over accelerated approval for a second. I'll go to priority review because this is also what's another designation. So it's something that's assigned to an application, whereas accelerated approval is more of an approval pathway. So priority review is granted, or a program can be designated as a priority review if it's an application for a drug, again, that treats a serious condition, That's sort of the common thread through all of these expedited programs, and would provide a significant improvement in safety or effectiveness over, or I'll stop there, significant improvement in safety or effectiveness. And so this is a designation that is given right before a marketing application comes in, or at the time a marketing application comes in. They might believe that they fulfill this criteria, and they would ask FDA if we would grant them a priority review. And what this means is that we would conduct our review activities on a shortened timeline. So for the most part, new molecular entities are reviewed over the course of 10 to 12 months, and priority review applications are reviewed in 6 months. And so this designation would be granted to those applications which we believed fulfill these criteria, and in which we would be shortening our time clock to get the drug approved faster and available to patients. And so for people who remember back to 2014, the OFEV and Esbriet, the nintedanib and pirfenidone applications, were submitted to the agency in May of 2014, and we committed to priority reviews for those 2 applications, and in fact they were reviewed under the 6-month time clock. So we do exercise regulatory flexibility when we see that there are drugs out there that have the potential to really fulfill an unmet medical need, and we have the data in hand to approve those drugs. So that's those are the 3 designations: fast track, breakthrough therapy, and priority review. And then finally, accelerated approval, which is also described in this guidance document that I'm referring to, and I can provide for listeners. It's available on our website, is an approval pathway. And so this is a little bit different than 3 other programs. And again, it is offered to, again, those drugs that treat serious conditions and generally provide a meaningful advantage over available therapies. But the difference in this program is that the approval basically takes place using what's called a surrogate endpoint. And this is an endpoint that FDA believes is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit, or a clinical endpoint that can be measured earlier than irreversible morbidity or mortality, and it's reasonably likely to predict the effect of the investigational treatment or other clinical benefit. So the difference in this expedited program is we're using this surrogate endpoint for approval, but then we would want to see confirmatory trials afterwards to confirm and verify, to describe that the effect that the surrogate endpoint actually demonstrated was followed up and confirmed by more definitive clinical endpoints. So this approval pathway is not something that we have historically used in our division. This is more often used in oncology, where the surrogate endpoint might be tumor shrinkage, and then the confirmatory trials are followed up to ensure that clinical benefit follows along with that. To bring it back to idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, I think we've come down to, with the review of the applications of pirfenidone and nintedanib, and review of the literature, and where everyone has academic thinking has sort of gone, we have accepted lung function as a clinically meaningful endpoint. And so if one were to say that that was a surrogate, further trials would be required. And so in this case, we're saying that it's a traditional approval pathway. That is the endpoint, and no further confirmatory trials are required.
Thank you for that. So you mentioned the 2 drugs that are approved by the FDA in the U.S. For IPF, which are nintedanib and pirfenidone. So we have a couple of questions that are focused more on interstitial lung disease and related forms of pulmonary fibrosis. The first is about patient-centered outcomes. You actually just addressed this with the the FVC measure that's been used in outcomes. So can you just maybe build on that or reiterate just a little bit about how the FDA's perspective on, say, in this case, what I would call a physiological endpoint, meaning a measurement of lung function versus a biomarker versus what we tend to call patient-centered outcomes, and I'll let you elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important question, and based on the approval of the two drugs that we're talking about, pirfenidone and nintedanib, looking at lung function, the physiologic endpoint of forced vital capacity, is sort of the current approval pathway. What's the ideal approval pathway? Survival benefit would be the ideal approval pathway, but those studies are difficult, if not impractical, to do. And even with lung function as a physiologic endpoint that we've sort of accepted based on our experience with the obstructive lung diseases, we can imagine that to show a benefit in lung function really does still require long studies, and we're not 100% sure that it tracks with how patients are feeling or functioning or surviving. We can maybe make that jump theoretically, logically, but we don't know that. And so we really have come, to rely and to really see the importance of patient-centered outcomes in interstitial lung disease and in IPF specifically, because this is something that is tangible to patients. The drug is making them feel better, it's making them function better, and so we really do see the importance of this. And as you know, we held a patient-centered drug development workshop in September 2014, right before the two IPF drugs were approved. And this really was helpful to us because we had patients, providers, even sponsors come out to listen, and we really wanted to engage the wider community to discuss how we could approach these meetings so that we could collect systematic data and maybe provide a framework for others to collect this data systematically too, so that we could sort of advance the science of patient input. And, while we're limited in our resources at FDA in order to take this information and really go forward and develop instruments, we really thought that this input from the patient community would support drug development more broadly and really help identify specific areas of unmet need by listening to what patients were suffering from the most, and also, help identify outcome measures that could be developed for clinical trials. So, we were really using that forum to communicate to sponsors and developers of instruments, because we think that, we have endpoints for now. Are they the ideal endpoints? I think it could be better, and I think that the patient-centered outcomes are the way that we could improve the drug development for IPF.
Thank you for that. I certainly share your sentiments about that. We certainly want drugs that help people live longer and healthier and better lives. And the open forum you mentioned, I think it was in 2014. What a fantastic thing that the FDA has been doing with that in many different disease states. That was a great forum. I remember it very, very well, hearing the panelists that had patients and advocates and family members on a couple of panels who just really communicated, I think, the disease state very, very well. And I'm glad, and I heard you speak there, and you were very eloquent and had wonderful things to say. So maybe we'll see more of those down the road. So, we do have a question. What's that?
No, I said I just said I hope so.
I hope so. Yeah, me too. So we do have a question about pirfenidone and nintedanib. You have already talked about this. Is there anything you want to add to the discussion we've already had? Are there any other unique aspects or anything else that would be of interest to our listeners, or do you think we've covered it?
You know, I think we've covered most of it. I think that, you know, I was involved in the review of both applications. I think that, you know, there were one of the aspects specifically to me that was unique was that we had both applications in-house at the same time, which very rarely happens. And so we really were able to review in concert these two entities. And I think one of the other, you know, very unique aspects was this, you know, the approval of these two drugs really did establish the precedent that we would look at lung function in IPF, specifically forced vital capacity, as an, you know, as a clinically meaningful endpoint and as a basis for approval. And so I think having both applications in-house at the same time, and, you know, it allowed us to find using this endpoint to be acceptable and to gain comfort with this as an endpoint for approval. It was a very concentrated but very intense. It was a very concentrated and intense experience because in a very short time frame, we spoke with experts, we convened advisory committees, and we really got a lot of input from both internally and externally. So it was an example of how the FDA really can do things quickly when it's necessary.
Yeah, I agree with that. That was very impressive. I don't know if listeners know, but the results of these clinical trials were published in May of 2014, and the drug was approved in October 2014. Of course, FDA certainly had the data before it was published, but that was very quick and very rewarding experience, I think, in the whole community of pulmonary fibrosis. Well, let's move on and tackle two additional terms, or well, I'll just leave them to you to define and help us understand. One is expanded access, which has been around for a while, and the other is right to try, which is a little bit newer. And I'm hoping you can shed some light on these for our listeners. These are questions we get quite commonly.
So expanded access is a program that that we have been operating under for many, many years. It's not a new program. And this really is meant to provide patients with access to drugs that may currently be under review or on their way to approval. And a lot of sponsors will actually ask for permission to have expanded access programs while their new drug applications are being reviewed. And this is just so that as the application is being reviewed, because as the listeners have heard, you know, we have timelines under which we review these applications, and while we try to be as expeditious as possible, again, you know, we do take time, and we don't want you know, patients who were participating in clinical trials and gaining benefit from a drug and a drug that's likely headed towards approval to be cut off from receiving that drug. And so under expanded access programs, they're able to continue to receive the drug while FDA is reviewing the efficacy and safety of the application. The right to try legislation is something that just came into effect, and this legislation gives terminally ill patients the right to use experimental medications that have not been approved by the FDA. And so, as many of the listeners may be aware, the President signed this law, the Right to Try Act of 2017, and this new law amends what I talked about earlier, which is the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And it's intended to increase access to certain unapproved investigational treatments, either drugs or biological products, for patients that are diagnosed with life-threatening diseases or conditions who have exhausted approved treatment options and are unable to participate in a clinical trial involving the investigational drug as certified by a physician. So an eligible patient under this Right to Try Act would be one with a life-threatening disease. Again, this is defined in the Code of Federal Regulations, and who meets certain other conditions that are set forth in the statute. And the investigational drug or biological product can only be provided under Right to Try if it's not approved or licensed for any use. It's completed just a phase 1 trial. So if listeners remember back to phase 1, that means that it was basically just given to humans, found to be safe and tolerable, but there hasn't been any investigation into its proof of concept of whether it works or not yet. And then if it is also the subject of a new drug application or a biologic application filed with us at the FDA, or is a subject of an active IND, which is an investigational new drug application, which is basically what all drugs are before they come in for marketing. It's under investigation in a clinical trial that's intended to inform the primary basis of a claim of efficacy. So to contrast it with expanded access often has more data associated with it. The Right to Try drugs will have less data in terms of their efficacy available for review. And again, it has to be a drug that's actively being developed, in that the development's ongoing and not discontinued, and it's not on what we call clinical hold. And for a lot of along different drug development pathways, if at any point we find a clinical trial at FDA to be unsafe, we put the application on what's called a clinical hold, which means it's there at that point the sponsor may no longer conduct studies. So in order for a drug to be accessed under the Right to Try, it cannot be on clinical hold. And so we're still trying to work out how we are going to how we at the FDA are going to deal with this Right to Try Act. We are reviewing the legislation internally, and we're working to implement it in a manner that's consistent with the congressional intent and with FDA's public health mission. And we receive a lot of questions about the process and how patients should go about inquiring about this, or figuring out whether they are eligible or whether a drug qualifies under the Right to Try Act to be administered. And at this point in time, I don't have a definitive answer for patients, but all I can say is we are really working as fast as we can to develop further information on how to respond to patient inquiries. And so at this point, we really do believe that sponsors who are developing the drugs are in the best position to provide information of the development status of their products. And I mean, that's really one of the key determinants to whether the drug is eligible for use under the Right to Try Act, and whether the sponsor intends to make an investigational product available under the Right to Try Act. So we at the FDA we're working currently to figure out how this fits into our regulatory framework and into our review processes. But we encourage patients, if they have questions about certain drugs or questions about whether they would qualify, to reach out to the sponsors of those drugs.
Thank you. That definitely clarifies it for everyone. And just for our listeners, when we say sponsor, we mean the drug developer, which might in many cases be a pharmaceutical company. That is our last slide. Yes, that is our last slide, our last question. I know a few of you have put some questions into the chat box. We're not going to be able to address them, but I do encourage you to email them to the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation. You can reach our Patient Communication Center at pcc@pulmonaryfibrosis.org, and we will do our best to give you all the information you want or need. And Dr. Karimi-Shah, I want to thank you so much. This was a fantastic webinar. It was extremely informative, answered a lot of questions we get. So now we have a lot of information we can provide to the patient community when they reach out to us with questions. And I hope in the year or two you'll come back and share some more important information with us. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, and thank you to our listeners.